Professor Craven, welcome. Things are not looking good for this pair, are they?
No, it's looking very, very bad. What's basically happened is they've moved from being in a pool of people who might possibly one day be executed to a short queue of people who, unless something happens, will be executed.
What is that something that could happen that could stop their execution?
Well, I think what has to happen is that Australians have to be clear that this is a matter for them and they need to be heard. This is a matter not only of criminal law but of international relations. The reality is, if we don't make it clear that this is unacceptable, then we become part of the authorising environment.
Do you think? What do you think about the response from the Australian public so far, knowing that these two are facing the death penalty?
I think the Australian public so far haven't focused because they've known they're facing the death penalty. They haven't known they're staring at it from 1 inch away. And so you don't focus on it until that end. When we see the sketches in the newspapers of what it looks like to face a firing squad, when we realise 2 more Australians in this environment of death are going to die, I think there's going to be an enormous focus.
Do you think their ethnic background has anything to do with what you describe as a muted response from the Australian public so far?
No, I think it's really that we haven't faced the fact that it's going to happen. Now it's staring us in the face. I think it will. But as I say, we have to face this. This is not Indonesia alone allowing this to happen. If this happens, it will be us allowing it to happen, and we have to be prepared to accept the moral burden of allowing 2 of our co-citizens to be blown apart.
But our government has made approaches to the Indonesian government to stop this happening. So how can you argue that the Australian public would share in the responsibility for that?
Well, I think there are 2 points. I think one is it's very important how the government makes the approaches. The government certainly has been making the approaches, and that's enormously important.
Yeah.
But, for example, the Prime Minister, I'm sure, doesn't want these 2 men to die, has basically put it like this. We don't want them executed, but we don't want to affect relations with Indonesia. Now, that is, I think, a far too muted message. It has to be the other way around. We don't want to affect relations with Indonesia, but the preservation of Australian lives is a fundamental matter of Australian importance. And if we don't do that, I think we do the Indonesians the grave disservice of sending a muted message, because there's no doubt if this goes ahead, once the pictures come out, once people realise what's happened, there will be a wave of revulsion, and we owe it to our friends in Indonesia to make that clear.
So you're saying Tony Abbott should come out today or in the next couple of days and say, if this goes ahead, this will affect Australia's relationship with Indonesia?
I think he needs to nuance the message. It's not the case that, well, look, we'd rather they were not executed, but the most important thing is that things go ahead. I think we need to understand that, in fact, it is a vital interest to Australians that people aren't killed, but more importantly, in a sense from statecraft, that the relationship won't go ahead smoothly once Australians realise what it is to be shot by firing squad. Once they realise that this is not a pretty little picture from an American movie, that it's real.
So do you think the Prime Minister should get specific on how the relationship could be affected if these executions go ahead? What do you specifically want from Tony Abbott on this?
Look, I think Tony Abbott has shown that he's a deft hand in foreign policy. I think Julie Bishop has done the same thing. No, of course we shouldn't be trying to dictate to the Indonesians what they should do, but we should be making it clear where the priorities sit, and we should be realistic. It's not the case that, look, we'd rather they didn't die. But really, it's the relationship. It's 2 things. It's we really don't want them to die, and we mustn't be naive pretending that the relationship won't be affected. So I believe that it should be, possibly a very subtle realignment, but it's incredibly important.
So is your argument about the Australian public bearing some responsibility for this if it goes ahead without making clear its protests based on what you see as a muted response from the government so far, or also a muted response from the Australian public generally?
I think both. I think it takes time for people's minds to concentrate on these things, but we're facing, and I agree utterly with Tony Abbott here, a culture of death in the world. We've seen what has happened in Paris. We've seen what happened in Martin Place. Now we're going to see this happen again. And we need to understand there will be no difference physically between what happened in Martin Place and what will happen in an Indonesian jungle. And if we're not doing our best to stop that, we couldn't stop Martin Place. We can have a hell of a go at stopping this. And that is a basic moral position. I think Australians have to face that. If we say, OK, it doesn't matter, these guys are drug runners, we don't care, it's not a case of letting the Indonesians do it. We're allowing it to happen.
Isn't that a bit of a stretch, though, and an insult to the Indonesians, equating terrorists shooting people and governments executing people for drug running?
Well, I think that's the point. There's no question that the victims in Shaliepo or in Martin Place, they're, in a sense, the virtuous dead. They're more deserving, they weren't drug runners and so on and so forth. And it's easy to draw that distinction. But if you see a film of Andrew Chan having his heart exploded, and if it goes wrong, then having his brains blown out, because that's what the regulations say you do, it's not going to be any different. There are going to be the differences of background, but the fact that it's an Australian, the fact that it's a human being, the fact that they're being horribly killed is going to be the same. And the only difference is that in Martin Place we were absolutely opposed and did everything we could do to stop it. Here the danger is we will be standing behind the firing squad.
So you've said what you want from Tony Abbott on this. What do you want? What do you think the Australian public should be doing over the coming days to try and support Muran Sukumaran and Andrew Chan?
Well, I think it's incredibly important that the public make their position known. I think one of the things that's vital for that is that they get behind the Mercy campaign. The Mercy campaign is on the web, mercy.org or .com. I'm not an expert in IT. I think they need to be contacting their governments. I think they need to be writing to their newspapers. I think young people who it's really going to matter what this country is like, what our values are. Kids in schools and universities, we need to make our position known. We need to help Tony Abbott by making it clear that we haven't sacrificed these two guys. Remember, these two people, I'm a lawyer, I'm cynical about reform. These two probably have the best record of reform that I've actually seen in prisoners. Now, if there's any value in life, we need to be expressing it to our government so our government can be absolutely clear what the interests of the Australian people are when they're talking to our friends in Indonesia, because that's what will preserve the relationship.
Okay, Professor Greg Craven, thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much.